Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Football Outsiders Fantasy Show. I'm your host, Scott Spratt, looking really stupid in what I can only assume is a fedora. I'll explain that in a second. But first, let me tell you, welcome to the Football Outsiders Fantasy Show. We are, as before, live 1 to 2 p.m. Eastern Time, Monday through Friday. Some combination of me, my co-host here, Derrik Klassen, Aaron Schatz, and Mike Tanier. But we've expanded our offering so you can catch us live on YouTube, on Facebook, on Twitch, and on Twitter. So we'd appreciate it if you would follow along with this live. Feel free to ask us questions, but obviously also feel free to listen to us after the fact on the Football Outsiders Podcast Network. Derrik, how's it going? I'm wearing this crazy fedora because I lost a bet with Football Outsiders writer Mike Tanier. I bet him straight up that the Panthers would beat the Cowboys, which he would probably tell me that I deserve to look stupid because that was a stupid decision. But what I would say is I still have a lot of faith in the Panthers this year. I think they're pretty good. Among the teams that, we might have thought were fraudulent for the first few weeks because of the schedule, I think Arizona, everyone believes in now. They're third in DVOA. Kyler Murray's an MVP candidate. But the Panthers are still 12th in DVOA. The Broncos are 15th, and the Raiders are 22nd. And I would kind of stack them up that way. But as an impartial observer not tied to this bet, Derrik, how stupid am I, and how stupid do I look?
All I would say is that even for how much better he's looked, I don't think I would be willing to stake my money or my pride on Sam Darnold, especially against Dak Prescott. So that's kind of where I would have fell on that. But if they're your team, sometimes you just gotta ride it out anyway.
That was the goal. I've been very impressed with Sam Darnold, but hey, you're the film guy. So what do I know? I'm sure Mike would say the best. Mike, congrats on your big win there. But we can't spend any more time on this because we have a lot of waiver wire players to discuss. Every Tuesday, Derrik and I go through the gamut. I write a waiver wire article up on footballoutsiders.com and I offer FAB recommendations. And Derrik, as more of a scouting expert with me, more the stats guy, can kind of critique me and say if I'm too high or too low. That's what we're going to run through today. And we're going to start that out with Bears running back Damien Williams. The news that broke pretty recently today on Tuesday is that David Montgomery's injury, as the Bears were hoping and predicted, he didn't tear his ACL on Sunday, but he did hyperextend his knee and is likely going to miss next 4 to 5 weeks, which opens up a pretty big window here for Williams to run as the lead back in the offense. I'm pretty optimistic because of that news. I bumped him up to a 65% FAB recommendation, and I'm saying you should use your number one waiver wire on him if you can. But I've always liked Williams as a player. So, Derrik, what do you think? Is that too high given only the month plus sort of expectation now with the Montgomery injury?
No, I mean, I think that's fine because if you can get 4 or 5 games out of him, I think that's plenty reasonable. And I think he's probably still going to be plenty productive. He's a really different runner than Montgomery. Montgomery is obviously a little bit more between the tackles. He wants to get upfield. He's going to balance through contact really well, that sort of thing. Whereas Williams is a little bit more of kind of like a boomer bust. You want to get him into space a little bit more, maybe run some more outside zone type of stuff. And I think you even saw that in the game where he got to play just this last week. Even before Montgomery went out, like they threw a pitch to him and then they had another play where they motioned him out to the flat before the snap and just wanted to get the ball out in space. So that kind of stuff is not necessarily there with Montgomery. The other thing that I would say is kind of encouraging is that last year without Williams, Montgomery kind of dominated their target share out of the backfield, even though he's not really seen as this great receiving back or whatever. Whereas more this year, they have kind of split the receiving duties, and it seems like they really already trust Williams to do that. So now with Montgomery out of the lineup, obviously, he's probably going to get a pretty nice uptick in targets there.
I think so too. The one warning there would be maybe that Tarik Cohen, who's on the PUP list, could potentially be back by week 7. So I'm a little concerned there. But as mentioned before, and I think as backed up by what you're saying, I think Williams is a really good player. I mean, it's kind of an out of sign, out of mind situation because Williams opted out for COVID concerns last year. But back in 2019, he had a 10.8% avoided tackle rate for the Chiefs. That was 8th highest among running backs with 100 or more carries. 3.0 yards after contact per attempt was 4th highest. And while, maybe that was a little bit fluky, like you said, I think he's more of a swinging around the outside guy, not necessarily a between the tackles type of runner. I think he's elusive, and I think that's what you're popping up there. And so, even if he's getting sort of a modest volume of carries, a modest volume of targets, maybe the rookie Khalil Herbert will be in the mix a little bit. I think that's going to be enough to make him a temporary running back too. And that's just really valuable right now when there's just not enough running backs to go around in fantasy, right, Derrik?
Yeah, I would agree. And like you said, I think since we already know that Montgomery is going to be out for probably at least a month, I mean, that's even if he kind of loses his, his share of targets and carries after that, to still get a month of startable play out of a guy that you can pick up right now, I think that's plenty valuable.
Absolutely. All right. I mean, I think that pretty much sums it up there. So why don't we just go ahead and move on to the Baltimore Ravens, where I'm suggesting Latavius Murray, still available in more than half of leagues right now. He is a 16% FAB bid. Murray ended up playing the lion's share of the snaps last week with the surprise Tyson Williams inactivation. But based on what you had told me about Williams as a pass protector and Le'Veon Bell, maybe this shouldn't have been as big a surprise as some of us thought in the fantasy community. So, Derrik, what are your thoughts on Murray specifically, but the Ravens backfield in general?
They were tricky to figure out because with Williams, I had said it, I think maybe 2 or 3 weeks ago, that he's clearly their best explosive play guy. I think he's the best guy that they can get outside the tackles, get into space, that sort of stuff. But, like you had just mentioned, he's not very good in pass protection, and he just doesn't do a lot of the stuff that would raise the floor for a rushing offense. Whereas I think Murray is kind of the opposite. He might not necessarily be the most explosive guy, but I think he's really good at getting downhill when he needs to. He's not really going to waste time. He's not going to waste steps. And he's a lot better in pass protection. So it seems like I thought they would kind of want to get explosive plays out of the run game and have Williams, but it seems they're more just valuing the floor at running back, praying that Lamar Jackson can get all the explosive plays in the run game, and then hoping that when they get the receiving room a little bit healthier, that will also help get some explosive plays. So it seems that that's kind of the direction they're moving, which also explains the Le'Veon Bell snaps, which he didn't get very many targets or carries, but even still, I think he probably brings us a little bit higher of a floor than Williams would.
And Bell immediately passed Devontae Freeman in the offense, playing 27% of snaps versus 8% for Freeman. So even if the team decides to bring Tyson Williams back, I'm not sure it's going to be at Bell's expense necessarily. So maybe Bell is a worthwhile consideration as well. I recommended him as sort of a modest 2 or 3% idea too, but Murray is clearly the star of this. He played 31, 36, and 33% of snaps in weeks 1 to 3, jumped up to 62% last week, had 18 carries. That was 8 more than he had in any of the first 3 games. He's not a pass catcher. And Bell is probably going to be that in the short term, or Williams if he comes back into the mix. But my thought was basically like, if you were relying on Gus Edwards as a fantasy relevant option in your league last year, then Murray can be that. Like that, it's maybe more skewed towards standard versus PPR leagues, but Murray's going to get a hefty amount of carries and probably be productive because the Ravens always let the running backs be productive with their scheme, right?
Yeah, I would agree. And that's the thing, is that there's always going to be a productive running back in this system. I think just projecting which guy it would be earlier in the year was a little bit trickier, but I think now they've kind of shown their hand with how they think about Tyson Williams, at least until maybe he fixes some of his issues. So like you said, I think the Murray FAB bid is probably pretty reasonable because I think he's going to continue to get a lot of the carries in this offense now.
We've got a user thought more than question, I guess, on the YouTube chat. Remember that we are live on YouTube, among other platforms right now, so you can jump on there and ask us questions every Monday through Friday, 1 to 2 p.m. Eastern time. He's saying that he recommends that you trade Logan Thomas for ruining his week 4 in fantasy. Unfortunately, I think Thomas injured himself. I think it was maybe a hamstring injury. Could cost him a couple of weeks. So Thomas will probably be fine for you in fantasy once he gets back. But I'm not really sure there's anybody to pick up on the team in the interim unless you're just looking at Curtis Samuel as sort of a player on the rise in general. But back to the main guys I think we're discussing today for the waiver wire pickups. We're going to move on to the number 3 option is Trey Lance, the quarterback for the 49ers. I'm saying an 11% FAB recommendation here. And I could say that's way too low or way too high. I'm not totally sure. I'd love to get your opinion here. The reason that it's sort of the timing now is that Jimmy Garoppolo had a calf injury, was kind of playing through it, had to sit, is in my mind likely to sit for this week. And I think the team is on bye in week 6. So maybe he'll be back after just the 1 game absence, but it's not like Garoppolo has been lighting the world on fire. And so much of the potential value with Lance is about his rushing ability. He ran 7 times for 41 yards, playing just 51% of the snaps. So I'm not really sure how much I care about how effective he is as a passer, but I was saying the same thing about Justin Fields. So maybe help me out with this, Derrik. Do you think that Lance is a worthwhile fantasy addition?
I love Lance as like a long-term being the guy in San Francisco, but I'm not sure I love him right now. Mm-hmm. And I think some of that is just, we always knew he was probably going to be a pretty inconsistent passer, like you mentioned. He hasn't really played football in a year. He was young to begin with. He had only started 1 year. His mechanics were always kind of, his accuracy probably needed a little bit of work. And I think we saw that a little bit in the game that he played. So I think that's going to be a little bit of an issue. What I would say that is maybe encouraging, even though I'm not sure I would go for the 11% FAB bid. The encouraging part is that a lot of his runs weren't designed. Like they were doing some option stuff, but he wasn't really taking it. A lot of his runs were just he didn't like what he was seeing on the field, and then he scrambled and took off. And so I think if we assume that if he gets a full game of starting, they're going to get a lot more of those designed runs in, and he's going to get some value there. So that would be the argument if I were to make it. But I still think he's probably going to be really inconsistent early on, and I think it's possible that even though Jimmy hasn't been playing very well, if he gets healthy, it's possible that, Kyle might just try to keep playing him anyway.
Yeah, I can see that. And one thing really supporting that angle is the fact that 76 of Lance's 157 passing yards and one of his 2 touchdowns last week came on just a total busted coverage on Deebo Samuel, where he was absolutely wide open on the right side of the field. And I think ran just like untouched for 76 yards for a touchdown. So
Kyle himself could have thrown that one.
Yeah, I think I probably could have too. I mean, I would have been destroyed before I got there, but don't look at that line and extrapolate that and double that and say, oh man, Lance is going to be this good. So I'm really taking more the angle of what you're saying about if Lance is going to be a one read and then take off and run type of guy, that can really work in fantasy. And I think before the season started, we were saying that the 49ers offense and the Kyle Shanahan scheme is so quarterback friendly because it relies heavily on short throws with yards after the catch. So like, even if Lance is going to be inaccurate, is going to make bad decisions, or maybe throw the ball a little bit too hard in some circumstances, I think he was less than 10% below expected completion rate last week. If he's going to run more than 10 times a game, I'm telling you that from fantasy perspective, he could still be really valuable. Do you think that the Shanahan scheme still is going to be something that can kind of work with a quarterback that even has some issues as a passer?
It might, but I think what's tricky is that Lance is somebody who I think they're really going to want to get the ball moving down the field more. And that's not at all what Jimmy does. So it's like a complete gear shift. And I think doing that in the middle of the season might be tricky for them to work out, especially because I think we've largely seen that the Shanahan offense kind of takes some time for guys to get used to. Even Matt Ryan, like it took him a year to really fully embrace what that offense was. So I think it's just one of those situations where I really like Trey Lance long-term, but if you're going to bet on him in the short term, I think it's almost strictly what he's going to be able to do as a runner, which, truthfully, he looked a little timid to me on the very little design stuff that they did for him, which is probably natural for a guy who's like 20 years old and is coming off of the bench in an NFL game he didn't expect to be playing in. So maybe with another week of play, he'll, of getting the starter reps, that he'll look a little bit more comfortable there. But I think to me, if you're going to bet on him, it's pretty much all what he can do on the ground right now.
I think that's fair. And even if I haven't piqued your interest there, I do have a couple more quarterbacks I think we may bring up and talk about on the show. So maybe I'll be able to convince you on those other ones. We got another question here on the YouTube chat. Zeke for Dalvin Cook in PPR. I would say yes. Dalvin Cook is still, he and McCaffrey, when healthy, I think are my top 2 options. I know that they both missed a little bit time early this season, but I think that's a definite go for trade there. This next one, I'm a little bit less sure. So my number 4 waiver recommendation at 8% is Alex Collins of the Seahawks. He had a surprising amount of work, I would say, in week 4, 10 carries and 2 targets versus 13 and 1 for Chris Carson. Played 39% of offensive snaps versus 45% Carson, where the week before I would have said that he's kind of barely involved in this offense. But I'm bringing this up and making kind of a bolder FAB recommendation because I've had my eye on Collins for a while. Back in 2017, he was the starting running back for the Ravens, had 1,160 yards from scrimmage and 6 touchdowns, was actually 3rd among running backs with a 15.3% DVOA that season. And then things kind of went wrong from him from there, got injured, ended up getting cut because he was arrested for, drug possession, for some other issues off the field. It's been 4 years, but he's back kind of making a little bit of a wave here, just 27 years old now. I've just been in love with this guy's talent this whole time. And do you think that that's justifiable? Do you think he's going to have a chance to work into the Seahawks offense?
I think it's possible because I think if you look at this last game, the first quarter of what they were doing against San Francisco, the offense was really like they were doing a lot more wide open. They were in 11. They were in, they were detaching the tight end. They were just doing a lot of stuff where they were trying to spread the field, and then Carson would kind of be just like just punch in there, we spread the field, and then we tried to just run it up the gut. It wasn't really working for them. And then after the first quarter, they were like, you know what, we're done with this. We're going to bring in another tight end. We're going to condense the formations, which obviously means you're going to have a lot more just garbage when there's that much more bodies that are there, right? And I think the value in Alex Collins is he has such light feet for a guy who is his size. I mean, he's so good at weaving in and out of traffic like that. So I think if they're going to lean more to that, condensing the formation a little bit and stuff like that, he's probably the better guy for that, because I think his vision and his manipulation of space like that is just so much better. And I think we saw it on one of his touchdown runs that he basically had Fred Warner jumping into a gap that was like completely on the other side of the play. So, I think like I said, if they continue to lean into that, which I think is probably their best look on offense, because when you get into more of that condensed stuff, and you're just pounding the rock, and you're having these heavier formations, heavier personnel sets that are forcing the other team to get into base, you open up play action for Russell Wilson, and that's really where he thrives as a passer. So I think that should be their identity as an offense, and I'm hoping that Pete Carroll is smart enough to just embrace that.
I hope so. We got a great comment here that Seattle's got a really tough game. They're on the short week on Thursday playing the Rams. So, I think last year the Rams may have been the number 2 run defense DVOA. So this may not be the total spot to actually rely on Collins from a fantasy perspective. But I also kind of like what you're saying about him stylistically, where he, despite being bigger at 210 pounds, I think at only 5'10". So in terms of a BMI type of perspective, is a pretty big back. Very light on his feet. I would say really sharp cutter, really quick accelerator out of his cuts, but also has really good hands. Caught the ball pretty frequently for that Ravens team, even for a team that didn't throw the ball a ton to their backs. So I wouldn't be shocked to see him contributing as a receiver more than Carson is. He had some buzz as maybe the third down back for the team in the early season before Rashad Penny got injured. And I think that he may contribute a little bit more in that kind of versatile perspective, that maybe that would work a little bit better when you're trying to not just run it straight at Aaron Donald. Do you sort of see that sort of versatile type of contributions that maybe make him a little bit more of an option for you in fantasy too?
Yeah, I do. I think that makes perfect sense. Again, it's kind of just going to come down to, is Pete Carroll and the Seahawks staff going to embrace that this is probably the best way that they need to play and stop spreading the ball and stop spreading the field with formations. So you're kind of putting your faith in the Seahawks staff rather than Alex Collins' ability. So I think the ability is there. It's kind of just a matter of which offensive identity are they going to commit to.
So they do have a new offensive coordinator right this year. I'm not sure I have the sophistication to really tell you what's different and not, but has that. So Carson's been a very successful runner, obviously, for the team over the last several seasons. I don't know. Is there any change with the scheme or something that might change what type of back is effective, or maybe just more generally shift workload from the run to the pass, or anything along those lines that you have thoughts on, Derrik?
I think, to me, just a lot of what they did this year was they tried to spread the offense out and shift some of the workload in trying to get your short yardage to the quick game for Russell Wilson, which Russell Wilson's a great quarterback, but that's not why he's a good quarterback. He's not that good at the quick game. And so I think they kind of just tried to shift away from that a little bit, and shift more of their stuff into the quick game. And I think, like I said, in the San Francisco game, when they stopped doing that and realized that if we just condense the formations, and really do a lot of what the Goff Rams teams were doing, and then get a runner who is obviously as clean as Alex Collins, I think that's really the formula that they need to keep leaning on. So, like I said, hopefully they start doing that again, but I don't know. We'll see.
Okay. Very cool. Next up, we have a tight end, Mike Gesicki from the Dolphins. I'm recommending a 7% FAB bid here. Had another nice game on Sunday, 5 catches, 57 yards, and a touchdown on 6 targets. His target share overall is 18.6%, which is 6th highest among tight ends. Actually just snuck ahead of TJ Hawkinson at 18.4%. And 2 weeks ago, I was telling you that Hawkinson was an obvious top 4 tight end. Not quite as sure now. But to me, the interesting thing about Gesicki is how his splits have looked with the different Dolphins quarterbacks so far this season. He saw just 2 targets with Tua under center. And while granted, Tua, only made 31 pass attempts before he injured his ribs, that's a 6.5% target share, which it could be Brissett. It's been 25 targets on 119 attempts, a 21% attempt that would make him a no-brainer top 5 at the position. So I'm curious, Derrik, do you think that Gesicki has just had some positive regression here? This is a player that's maybe, I think, in his 4th year or so. We've kind of seen a slow build the way that you often see with the better tight ends in the league. Or do you think there's something about Tua versus Brissett that maybe have led to this increase in workload that when Tua gets back in week 6, that maybe it goes away?
I don't think that, because what did you say with Tua? He only had like 2 targets or something insane.
2 to Gesicki out of 31 total.
Yeah, I think that that's probably a little bit lower than it would be when Tua gets back. But I do think that, like, stylistically, the quarterback thing is legitimate. I think Jacoby Brissett is someone who I think they want to get in a little bit more like traditional dropback stuff, which I think opens up more opportunity for Gesicki. And I think Jacoby Brissett is a little bit more willing to throw to the areas of the field that Gesicki is going to get his targets in, kind of over the intermediate area. Whereas I think Tua is a passer who really likes to have guys in space and try to like maximize yards after the catch, that sort of thing, which I think, once he gets back is probably the receivers, if anything, might be a little bit more valuable. So I think that would kind of be where I split it. So if you can get Gesicki for the cheap until Tua gets back, maybe it's worth it. But I think other than that, I'm not sure I love it, to be honest, especially because it's very clear how they use Gesicki. They split his snaps in a very particular way. They have 2 other tight ends that they will put on the field because Gesicki just refuses to block and he can't do it. And so you really never see him in line. He's really just a receiver at this point who kind of gets called a tight end, whereas the other guys are more legitimate tight ends. And, it kind of just depends on what they want to do with the offense. But yeah.
So, I mean, Gesicki, either the poor man's or maybe the rich man's Kyle Pitts, depending on your perspective of things there. I'm actually completely in lockstep with you here, which is interesting because the stats kind of tell the same story that you're seeing as a scout, where last year Gesicki had 2.0 yard average separation according to Next Gen Stats. That was the 3rd lowest among all receivers with 43 or more targets. With Tua with the poor arm strength, maybe a little bit less willing to work the middle of the field, less willing to throw it to contested catch type of receivers. That's him and Devontae Parker, by the way, who I think was tied for the lowest average separation. I don't think that's a fluke either. And I mean, last year, you're right. Tua targeted Gesicki 14.8% of the time. So it wasn't nearly as low as we saw in the first game and maybe 3 plays in the second game before he got hurt. But, 14.8% is really, really different from the 18.6% that you're seeing so far for the full season with Gesicki, mostly with Brissett under center. So I'm kind of with you that it's fool's gold, but I mean, the target rate is high enough overall that I don't think you can totally ignore them, because after those top guys with Gronk out now too, it's like there may be 3 or 4 tight ends that you feel pretty good about, but after that, there aren't a lot of guys. I'll let you tell me a little later whether you think he or Dalton Schultz maybe makes more sense, but I think it's in the range where you need to keep him on your fantasy rosters. But I do think starting in week 6 when Tua gets back, Gesicki may not be the same value that he appears to be based on the last 2 games. All right, we're getting bevies of questions here. Let me scroll back down and try to find this last one where we got Michael asking us if he needs to panic trade any of his options. Has Justin Herbert, Dalvin Cook, Stephon Diggs, Keenan Allen, Melvin Gordon, Kyle Pitts, and is asking he doesn't want to make any panic trades. I would basically tell him, don't make panic trades. Like, I think a lot of these guys are really good. Diggs maybe only has 1 touchdown this season, but he still has a top 5 target share. Going to be really good. Dalvin Cook obviously missed a game and only played half his normal workload last week. That's going to be fine. We brought up Pitts. I still think Pitts is probably a top 10 tight end. His snap share and his target share sort of show that. But have you changed your mind about Pitts more so than we said even last week?
I mean, I just have to imagine the production is going to get there at some point. Like, he looks so good as a football player on the field, and the targets just aren't there yet for whatever reason. Maybe it's in part because, Matt Ryan's arm strength does look a little bit deteriorated, and maybe he's less willing to target the intermediate area of the field. Kind of like you were just saying with Tua and the arm strength problem. Yeah. It could be a little bit of that, but like, I just can't imagine somebody who is as talented as him and is getting open as frequently as he can. Like, I have to imagine at some point it's going to pay off. Maybe that puts you in a hole too early and it doesn't end up mattering by the time he does start to pop off. But like I said, I think you hold on to him and eventually it's going to work out.
I mean, I don't know who's going to be able to beat out Cordarrelle Patterson for targets. So it's just, that's not Kyle Pitts' fault. He just got drafted in a really bad situation there.
Patterson's a Hall of Famer, man. You can't beat that out.
I think he is a Hall of Famer. So yeah, I won't provide any more commentary on why that might be. But,
Exactly.
but absolutely. All right. I mean, we're still getting more questions. I'll try to get to them here and out. But again, if you're on YouTube with us live from 1 to 2 p.m. Eastern, you can ask us questions and interact with us. We're happy to respond to as many as we can. But Derek, we've got a lot of guys still to hit on for the waiver wire recommendation. So let's keep that ball rolling with A.J. Dillon of the Packers. I'm saying a 66% FAB recommendation here. Kind of like a guy we talked about a few spots ago in Collins. He had a surprising split of the workload with starter Aaron Jones this last week, 15 carries versus 15 also for Jones, also contributed a catch on a target, and has been a little bit more involved as a receiver this year with 6 targets versus 2 all of last season than many expected. I would kind of put that in the Damian Harris bucket, where it's like, it's not like it's a good total, but given that it's higher than expected, maybe that kind of moves him a little bit onto the fantasy radar with the other skills involved. But I don't know. Maybe this was like a weird one-off game. What are your thoughts on Dillon? Is he going to maybe make waves as the second runner clearly for the Packers?
I can see both sides of it, because I think in terms of like a one-off game, I want to say Aaron Jones came into the game with a little bit of an ankle issue. So I think it would make sense that maybe they would just split up the carries a little bit more to try not to re-injure Aaron Jones. So I think that could be part of it. But at the same time, like, I think even though they didn't end up paying him, like, Green Bay liked Jamal Williams for a reason. It's because he was really good between the tackles, and he was a really good pass blocker. And I think you see some of the same stuff with Dillon. They haven't like fully committed to him in the same way, but I think it's entirely possible that as the year goes along, as they start to really find their identity as an offense, what really works for them, what doesn't work for them, I think it's possible that they might value A.J. Dillon's, downhill style a little bit more. So 6% is maybe fine, but I don't know. I think that this is one of the ones that is a little bit trickier for me to figure out.
It's fair. I mean, it's like a lot of these guys, honestly. It's a little bit more speculation than it is here's a target to actually play for you in week 5. But the reason that I'm speculating a little bit too is that Dillon hasn't really even been involved in the way that I thought might be the way in the preseason, where the guy's like 250 pounds. Like, I mean, he looks like Derrick Henry. I don't think it's entirely a coincidence that a former offensive coach for the Titans ended up, wanting this guy on the team. And he's got zero rushing and receiving touchdowns this year, just 0.1 expected. Aaron Jones is at 5 touchdowns and 3.4 expected. But Dillon is the one that you would expect to be sort of the bigger after contact guy. He actually was number 2 among running backs in yards after contact per attempt last season. Granted, if you lower the threshold to 40 carries, which is like basically all he had last season, but it makes sense that he would be really good at pushing the pile. And I feel like as the season goes along, that might be a good way to keep Aaron Jones out of the injury concerns. You don't need to give him those carries. Doesn't really matter. And you really want him more in space and catching the ball out of the backfield. So I think there may be a little bit more yin and yang here in the future, kind of like there was with Jamal Williams last year, like you were saying. So I'm willing to speculate that he ends up getting up to that. Maybe in the second half of the season, he ends up being one of the 20 running backs that's scoring the most touchdowns, even if it's on a 40% snap share. So that's kind of what I'm saying here. Maybe more of a deeper league option than anything else, but I think that he might have fantasy value even when Aaron Jones is healthy, which is saying more than most handcuffs can claim. Mm-hmm. All right. So Trexel on the YouTube chat asks, which wide receiver has exceeded expectations from last year to this one so far? I have an obvious answer, and then I don't know if you have one too, Derek. And for me, it's Mike Williams. This may be more the public expectations than my own expectations, because the point that I've tried to hammer home with Williams was that over the last 2 seasons, he had the biggest shortfall in expected versus actual receiving touchdowns. He just looks like a touchdown scorer. He's 6'4", a great leaper, great in contested catch situations, had 10 touchdowns on just like 40 something catches in his second season in the league. So I think it's been a really unlucky run to this year, and it's all coming together, both with, knock on wood, so far with him being healthy, with Justin Herbert being his quarterback now, being somebody that can really kind of win down the field and enjoying a year 2 breakout. So I would say that Williams is a totally legitimate wide receiver 2, which I'm not sure if everyone is believing that after last night's kind of quiet game or not, but that's the one that jumps out to me. Is there any receiver that you've been really impressed by so far this season?
I mean, I think Williams is a good one. I think the way that the offense is structured now, especially with the guy they have at quarterback, who's very willing to just throw the ball to these jump ball players like that, to a guy like Williams and to a lot of their tight ends. So I think he's a good one. I think Emmanuel Sanders has also been really, really nice. And I think he has a better fitting quarterback for him now than he did last year. Obviously, Breeze like had a great career, whatever. But I think we like the end of Breeze's career, you weren't able to get some of the downfield value that Sanders can provide. And like I said, I think last week, Sanders can do some of the short to intermediate stuff, but part of his value is that he also helps you stretch the field.
Yeah.
Now that he's with Allen in Buffalo, I think we're seeing a little bit more of like the totality of his skill set again. I think, I think he had kind of been forgotten about a little bit, but now, like I said, he's in a really good situation for him to get a little bit of everything out of his skill set.
Well, speaking of quarterbacks in their second seasons, my next waiver recommendation is Joe Burrow at a 4% FAB bid. And honestly, I would be willing to spend a lot more, but for me, this is just about, it doesn't really seem like there's very much buzz for Burrow this season, and I don't understand it. Maybe it's about Herbert, and Burrow isn't as good as Herbert, or at least doesn't have the same arm talent at the very least, right? But if you just look at his numbers, everything looks amazing. 72.9% completion rate so far this season, 9.2 yards per pass attempt, 9 passing touchdowns. All 3 of those stats are top 5 among all quarterbacks. And like, frankly, I feel like this follows the sort of general expectations you would have had for the number 1 pick last season with all of the offensive skill talent around him. Maybe the pass protection isn't great, but the point that I've been trying to make with him is that 1, sacks are more a product of quarterback play than offensive line play anyway. And 2, he seems to have all of those intangible skills about reading defenses, making changes to the pass protection based on the pressure that he's seeing in pre-snap, all of that type of stuff that I think makes him look like a really, really good NFL quarterback to me. I would be happy to roll with him as a quarterback 1 the rest of the way. But do you think I'm getting a little bit carried away there, Derek? Have you liked what you've seen as well?
I still think like Burrow is good, but I think they've gotten very, very lucky in terms of the fronts that they've played, because I still think that offensive line is not good at all.
Yeah.
But they played, I think, a Minnesota front that is not as good as people I think were expecting heading into the year. And then they played Chicago and got hammered.
Yeah,
and then they played a Pittsburgh defensive line that was missing a bunch of guys. They were missing TJ Watt, Alex Highsmith, Stephen Tuitt, I think, maybe Tyson Alualu. Like, they didn't have anybody up front to rush the passer except for Cam Hayward. And then they played a Jaguars defensive line that really doesn't have any NFL players. So I think they've gotten very fortunate with the guys that, with the fronts that they've matched up against. But to that point, I think you can still play him and get a really high ceiling if he's going to play against teams that can't really rush him. I think so. To me, he could kind of be a little bit more of a gamble in terms of if he's facing a team that can actually get to him, he could have some bad games. But I think if you can get him against a couple of decent fronts and decent matchups where he's not going to get rushed very often, and they can do a lot of the 5-man pass pro that for some reason they love, even though they can't block it. I think then he can actually be really productive, because like you mentioned, even if the offensive line is great, if they can be okay enough versus bad fronts, Joe Burrow is very smart, and they have just an unbelievable amount of skill talent. So,
I mean, I'm a huge advocate of streaming with quarterbacks. I think that's a strategy that fantasy players don't use nearly enough in their shallower formats. And obviously it depends on who your quarterback is. Like if you're trotting out Patrick Mahomes and Russell Wilson every week, don't stop doing that for Burrow's sake necessarily. But I think that if you're kind of in the back end of that top 10, don't feel like you have to play Ryan Tannehill every week. Like a lot of these guys have really obvious tendencies. And for Burrow, it probably is, how much pressure do you expect the defense to be able to get on him? Because I think that's probably a pretty good lever for his fantasy value. One thing that's interesting here with the statistics is that Burrow has 6.1 passing touchdowns over expectations so far this season. Basically, those stats are looking at where the touchdowns are coming from and is telling you that Burrow has thrown touchdowns from longer range than you would typically expect touchdowns to be scored. Now, from a running back and receiver perspective, when those guys exceed those totals, you're just like, this is going to regress, no brainer. With quarterbacks, it's a little bit more complicated, because when Burrow throws a 40-yard touchdown pass to Jamar Chase, what he might be doing is preventing himself from throwing a 15-yard touchdown 6 plays later. So like, there's a little bit of complexity there. But the thing that's interesting here is that, Mahomes is the number 1 surplus guy, and that's what you would expect. He's got tremendous arm strength, can sling it down the field to, Tyreek Hill and whoever else. You're expecting him to lead the league in long touchdowns. But the rap on Burrow after year 1 was that, he's very smart, but may not have the arm strength to get the ball down the field. Showed really bad, I would say, deep splits last season relative to where he did on the intermediate and shorter throws. Has there been anything different with Burrow in the long game this season? Is it maybe just Jamar Chase himself? Is it maybe, like you said, it's the defenses that he played? Is that maybe an area where Burrow is due for a little bit of regression going forward?
I think this year is the regression because like his numbers were horrible last year down the field.
True. Yes.
And I think he was more accurate than those numbers showed, than the production showed. But I think Chase is like the perfect guy to kind of unlock him. I think Chase is really, really good at winning down the sideline on just like a straight, 9 go ball or whatever. So, and I think truthfully, that's really the only deep ball Burrow can throw. I don't think he can throw a lot of like the deep post, the seam balls and stuff. Sure. Like those are tough for him. He just doesn't have the arm strength, especially if he's going to throw it late in the down. But if you have, if you're just running straight 4 verticals, or if you're running a stick concept and your outside guy is running the bus ticket go ball, then like, yeah, Burrow can throw that, and Chase is really good at getting open on those. And so I think they just have a really good connection there. And it's probably not going to keep up to quite the same degree that they've had to this point in the year, but I think it's probably still something that is not going to like totally crash down to earth or anything like that.
Okay. Well, let's stick with the Bengals for the next FAB recommendation. Samaje Perine, I'm saying a low 3% FAB, but this is based on the report that Joe Mixon could miss a week or 2 with an ankle sprain. I think the key thing here is that you're always looking for the word high. Is it a high ankle sprain? And by all accounts, it isn't. And I've actually even seen some conflicting reports that Mixon may even be able to play this week. So who knows? I wouldn't get too carried away from that perspective. But the other reason here too is that I just don't think Samaje Perine or rookie Chris Evans has the versatility that Joe Mixon does, which I think is so critical in this offense, because the fact that they didn't invest more in the offensive line, grabbing a guy like Chase, I'm just not sure they have the run blocking to really make somebody like Perine, who's maybe more of a bulldozer through the tackles guy, not much of a contributor as a receiver. Is he going to be able to do much for you in fantasy if Mixon does end up missing a game or 2?
I don't think so. I mean, because to your point, he doesn't have any of the versatility that Joe Mixon has, which I think is going to be a problem. And also, I just think he's not a very talented runner. I mean, he's kind of, he's bulky, so he can kind of bounce guys off every now and then, but I don't really think he accelerates through contact very well anymore. And he's not really a guy who's very shifty and going to make people miss in space. So I think he's just not a particularly great runner. And I think because of that, like you mentioned with the offensive line stuff, it's not like you can just generate yards in the ground strictly by how good their offensive line is. That's not going to happen. Mixon's explosiveness is kind of a big part of anything they get going in the ground game. So I think it would be more likely that they just revert back to, okay, Joe Burrow's going to be an empty for 80% of the game, and we're going to replace our run game with 3-yard passes to the tight end and that sort of thing.
I think that's probably fair. I'm going with Perine here with the assumption that the snaps are going to play out like they have so far this year. He's outsnapped Chris Evans 44-9 on the season, but it's also possible that you're just kind of reading that as Perine being a change of pace to what Mixon is specifically. So is it possible that maybe Evans is the one that ends up playing a little bit more if they need a little bit more than what Perine is doing? Frankly, I don't really know much about Evans. I'm just kind of reading into the fact that he was a 6th-round pick, hasn't played a lot this year, assuming that he's going to still take the back seat here. But is he any more versatile than Perine, such that maybe he would be the guy to benefit?
Truthfully, I don't really know a whole lot about Evans either, so I'm not going to sit here and lie and say that he offers something completely different. So I'm not sure.
That's fair. So like I would say maybe in your shallower leagues, this is a situation to avoid. But the one thing that I feel fairly confident saying is that like if Burrow gets this team down within the 1 or 2 yard line, Perine probably would be the back that kind of crashes that in for the touchdown. So if that's something that might work for you, this is kind of a throwback, but if you were relying on Steven Davis back in his like later career days for fantasy value, then maybe Perine makes sense in your league chasing touchdowns, but maybe not the option that you would hope, given that he could be a pretty heavily used back with Joe Mixon on the sideline for a week or 2. Let's jump to a back that I'm a little bit more optimistic about, although maybe more from a long-term perspective than a short-term perspective. That's Michael Carter, rookie running back for the New York Jets. I'm saying a 3% FAB bid here. Again, this is really more of a long-term speculation than anything else, but he has seen his workload increase a little bit, kind of busting out of his committee. His snap shares have increased from 25% in week 1 to 45, 43, and now 51% over the first 4 weeks. And his carries and targets have jumped from 6 in week 1 to 14, 12, and 16 the last 3 weeks. There actually aren't as many running backs getting even 14 opportunities per game the way that you would think. That's top 30 among running backs over the last 3 weeks. So maybe Carter's trending. What do you think of Carter, the player? Is he going to be able to benefit if he's not getting the like total lion's share, I guess, of the work?
I think he can still be pretty decent. I guess part of the hope is that you pray that when this Jets offensive line maybe gets a little bit healthier and you have some of your younger guys get a little bit more time under them, that maybe the run blocking will get a little bit better and that could help him. But I think Carter probably just offers a little bit of everything compared to some of the other backs in that backfield. Like, I don't think anybody has Jamal Williams or Zeke Elliott, like super high floor, like they can squeeze the most out of every run. I'm not entirely sure any of those guys have that, but Carter is probably the closest that they have to that, even though he's not like a huge back. And I think he can be pretty effective in the receiving game. He's obviously really good if he can get into space. So to me, I think he probably offers the most of everything. And I think if we assume that they're going to try to keep, getting him touches because he can do a little bit of everything, I think he's probably a guy who you probably want to bet on now. And in a few weeks, he's probably going to be more of their number one guy, I would think.
Yeah, I mean, I think you have to assume that whoever the receiving back is for this team is the only one that has a chance at fantasy value, because if the Jets are going to continue to get blown out in their games, like the ticket to fantasy production is going to be those check down passes when they're extremely pass heavy later in games. And I do think that's Carter. But kind of what you were saying about the overall versatility, I think Carter is bigger than a lot of people expect because he's only 5'9". And so whatever it is that his weight is, it's probably 200 or not much over that. It plays a lot bigger at his stature. So I don't think it's crazy to think that he's going to be, pushing up toward 20 opportunities per game. It may be more like 14 carries and 6 targets kind of a deal, but like that can work for you in your PPR types of formats. So I think that this is a pretty good opportunity to get ahead of things when he hasn't scored a bunch of touchdowns so far this season, hasn't really popped from a fantasy production standpoint. Maybe you can sneak that in and get sort of a flex worthy back in the back half of the season right now for cheap, right?
Yeah, I would think so. And like I said, I think he just offers – I think the other two guys that they have on their roster, Tevin Coleman and Ty Johnson, they're both very like super boomer bust types. And I think at some point the staff is going to just rely on Carter to be a little bit more consistent at some point.
Yeah. So in the YouTube chat, Benjamin Robinson pointed out from our last guy that Chris Evans is more of a receiving back, kind of putting that comparison there. So maybe he would get a little bit more in the mix than I would have suggested with the Perine commentary. Benjamin Robinson would certainly know. He does all of the analysis of all the different mock drafts out there. So he studies these guys backward and forward. I would encourage everybody to check out his work. But also point out too that, please feel free to chat with us, ask us questions, tell us when we're wrong. We love that. 1 to 2 p.m. Eastern time, live on YouTube, Twitch, Facebook, and Twitter, Monday through Friday. So we really appreciate that. But Derek, getting back to the last handful of guys that we have as waiver recommendations for this week. Next up is Laviska Shenault, wide receiver for the Jaguars. I'm saying is a 3% bid. The bulk of this here is the fact that DJ Chark unfortunately fractured his ankle on Thursday night. I think it's likely that he may miss the rest of the season, which cuts down on the number of like actual NFL options on the team to a pretty small number. Marvin Jones has still been getting the most offensive snaps every week. And even though Chark played 5%, Jones 93% versus 75% for Shenault. But Shenault may be their best option from like a shallow target perspective, especially given that they're running backs. They don't really have a true pass catcher coming out of the backfield there. So I'm wondering if Shenault could maybe PPR his way to some fantasy value with a little bit less competition from Chark on the outside. But what are your thoughts on Shenault, or maybe more generally what you've seen from the Jaguars offense from Lawrence? Can he prop up some of these guys from a fantasy perspective?
I think with Shenault, PPR has to be the way, because I think as like a legitimate receiver, he just doesn't look very good right now. I think he's not very explosive getting out of his breaks. I think he's done a really bad job. He's just constantly gotten hemmed up by cornerbacks. I think it was him who caught the deep ball from Lawrence, which just like Lawrence can do that, but I don't think that's going to be Shenault every play. And I think betting on that for him, a guy who I think generally does not do very well down the field, is probably like a weird thing to bet on. Yeah. I think to your point, he's probably more of like a PPR guy where they're going to hit him on a lot of shallows, maybe try to get him on like slants, maybe like jet touch passes and stuff like that. I think he's a guy you want to get the ball as soon as possible, because he's really more of a running back who is like masquerading as a wide receiver. And so I think that's probably
his pre-draft thing was like, it struck me as someone that doesn't really know. He sounded like a Curtis Samuel type. Like, is he a running back? Is he a receiver? We're not really sure, but hopefully we can get him the ball in space.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think I even had like a joke tweet where I was like, if they don't announce him as an H-back, then like I don't want to hear it when he got drafted. So I think he's definitely more of like a utility underneath type of piece. So again, in a PPR league, you could probably get away with this kind of bid. I think in a standard league, I don't know. I think
I don't
betting
think I
on
would want him there either.
yeah, I'm not very big on him in a standard league, I don't think.
But the PPR thing, like Shenault has had 7 or more targets in weeks 1, 2, and 4. And week 3 was the week that he was dealing with the shoulder injury. So like it seems to be there. And with Lawrence, like, I know in week 1 he almost threw for 400 yards and had just an unbelievable garbage time performance, down a few scores to the Texans. Since then, it's been closer to like 200 to 240 passing yards per game. It doesn't seem like that's going to be enough. But the thing about Lawrence is he's playing a legitimate NFL quarterback, willing to make the mistakes, but forcing the ball down the field, not forcing, like being aggressive, not checking it down too much, that kind of stuff. And so like his wide receiver target share is higher than you would expect from a rookie quarterback. So I think it was like 13th or so at the position. So, I think he probably can support your Shenaults, your Marvin Joneses of the world, even if there aren't a lot of ancillary guys like tight ends and running backs that really have a ton of value around him. All right, next up, we have Jamison Crowder, slot receiver for the New York Jets, hitting on this Jets value, obviously. 3% FAB recommendation, kind of talking about the rookie quarterback angle. Like, I'm not sure Zach Wilson is going to be propping up a lot of these outside receivers the way that maybe Trevor Lawrence can. Not all his fault. I mean, the pass protection seems really poor without Mekhi Becton there. But the interesting about Crowder is that he is kind of a good bailout option for you as a slot receiver. And you were seeing that earlier in the year when Crowder was out with Braxton Berrios, who in weeks 1 to 3 had a 20.6% target share. That was 41st among wide receivers. Well, Crowder came back, took 62% of offensive snaps versus 15% for Berrios. So 1, I'm confident that he has that slot job on lockdown. And 2, Crowder last year, 25% target share, was 14th among wide receivers. You may not have noticed because he didn't score a lot, which you may not this year. He also missed maybe 4 or 5 games, so it kind of slid under radars. But Crowder really could maybe be a flex option for you in your PPR formats. But do you think that may be getting out of hand with also guys like Corey Davis, Elijah Moore, who missed last week with an injury, but is going to play, some of these better skill options next to Crowder? Is that going to affect it, maybe make him a little bit less appealing from a fantasy perspective than I'm suggesting?
I don't know. I kind of like it. I mean, I think if part of it is like if we assume that Wilson is going to maybe get a little bit more, clear-minded in how he's seeing the field as the year goes on, then maybe that probably opens up some more underneath opportunities for Jamison Crowder. And to your point, like he has the slot job on lock. I think when Elijah Moore comes back from injury, like they're not chipping into each other's snaps, which even kind of is nice for Elijah Moore when you think about it. But we'll have to see what they do when they get into 2 receiver sets, whether they favor Moore or whether they favor Crowder. It might be Moore just because I think he's a guy who can be outside and inside, whereas Crowder is more kind of locked to being an inside guy. But I think when they go to a lot of the 11 personnel and they're trying to get a guy in the slot, it's going to be Crowder every time. So I think he's going to get for sure the snap volume. Target volume is maybe a little bit relying on Zach Wilson learning how to be an NFL quarterback, which we'll see if that happens. But I think the snap share is absolutely going to be there. So I kind of like it, actually.
Yeah, it's like the way that I saw it this last week with Moore out, it was Keelan Cole was the major sort of beneficiary on the outside. He played 59% of offensive snaps. I didn't write it down, but I think he was under 25% or so the first few weeks. So I know this was kind of confusing entering the year because Elijah Moore was somebody you thought maybe had inside-outside versatility. I'd say Keelan Cole actually has inside-outside versatility, but to me, it's clear that Crowder, who really is a slot-only option, he's the guy that's going to be taking that work in 11 personnel. So I do think that when they fall behind and they need to check the ball down, if it's not Michael Carter out of the backfield, I think it's going to be Crowder. So I think that there's kind of an avenue to fantasy value there, even if the Jets aren't really having a ton of offensive success. All right, we have another question here for Michael Hamilton, kind of jumping back to the quarterback discussion we had earlier. Do you prefer Joe Burrow or Derek Carr from a fantasy perspective? And I will say, like, this is probably the perfect range to be playing the matchups from a week in, week out perspective. But if I were going to pick one and go with them, I actually would pick Burrow. I know that Carr had the faster start to the season, at least from a narrative perspective. But like, if one of those 2 quarterbacks throws 40 touchdowns this year, I think it's going to be Burrow for sure. So I'm betting on the higher upside there. And I actually think the dramatically better skill talent, which, I know Darren Waller is maybe better than everybody that Burrow has to throw to. But I just really like what's going on there. I think Burrow is really smart and kind of coming into his own. But you're a little bit lower maybe on what he can do this season from a fantasy perspective. So what are your thoughts, Derek?
I still think, like I had said earlier when we were talking about him, it's still probably a little bit like offensive line, defensive line dependent. But to your point with the skill talent, I think because the skill talent is so much better in Cincinnati right now, you probably have a higher ceiling where those, good matchups have the potential to look fantastic. Whereas like Carr's sure, Henry Ruggs can hit on some explosive plays, but I don't think they have this insane receiving core that is really, you can have these just immaculate games. Whereas I think at least with Burrow, those games are possible. So I would actually, even though I'm not the highest on Burrow's fantasy, outlook right now, I would probably lean a little bit more to him.
All right, another question on YouTube from Joey Sucks. Great handle. Derrik, this is a good one for you since you do all of the quarterback prospect research. Was Zach Wilson a quick read guy at college at all? I remember hearing a lot about how he could throw from weird arm angles. You get the Patrick Mahomes comparison and stuff, but I don't know. It hasn't gone great for him, I would say, so far in the NFL, and the situation is bad, but is he sort of approaching the game from the right perspective given the talent around him, do you think?
I mean, I don't think Zach Wilson was I think any of the quick stuff they did in college with him was really a lot of RPOs, a lot of them to the outside. I think that was kind of their thing. Or he would just be a lot of offenses do this, but where they'll just run a 10-yard out with your boundary receiver and your quarterback will just kind of automatically throw it. That was the extent of Zach Wilson reading quick game. He just didn't really do it a lot. So I think the value that Crowder is probably going to get is not so much in the drop back quick game where Wilson is just hitting him right at the end of the drop. It's going to be a little bit more of maybe Zach Wilson scrambles and needs the closest guy to him, probably going to be Crowder. Maybe he's checking it down late in the play, probably going to be Crowder. So I don't think it's so much as the 1, 2, 3 hit the top of your drop quick game stuff. Yeah. I think it's going to be a little bit more Crowder is kind of picking up the pieces where some of the other guys might not.
Okay, very fair. All right, we have one more waiver guy to hit on, Derrik, and that's Kenneth and/or Kenny Gainwell for the running back for the Philadelphia Eagles. Honestly, I'm not sure what he prefers to go by, but I've seen some Kenny lately, so I think he's clearly kind of making some waves in the NFL. Last week, I wouldn't say he was tremendously productive, had just 3 carries, but did score a touchdown. But more importantly, 6 catches for 58 yards on 8 targets. Miles Sanders really hasn't been getting as big a workload share as you might have expected entering the season. And in terms of snap shares, it was 39% for Gainwell versus 64% for Sanders on Sunday. So Gainwell, it's not a traditionally valuable, I would say, workload, but he's kind of got that J.D. McKissic type of role where he's got a 12.6% target share, top 15 at the position. From a deeper PPR league perspective, maybe that has value, but do you think this has been a little bit of a product of, the touchdown and some of these other kind of fluky things, or do you think Gainwell is really making waves and could be a major part of the Eagles offense this season?
I think if they start running the ball more, it's not going to be Gainwell. I think it would be Sanders. So maybe that's kind of why you might want to steer away from him. But I do think the way that they use him is really cool. When they went to a lot of empty stuff this past week, he was kind of the guy that they were moving around and trying to get into space and trying to get him the ball. They had one play where they had him split out to the left, I think in empty. He motions in, he runs a shallow, and then Hurts kind of gets pressured and is able to find him on the shallow. I think on maybe a 4th and 2 it might have been. So it's clear that they're trying to find ways to get him the ball. I think they had another screen that they threw out to him to the right. So he's a guy who I think they clearly are trying to give the ball, just not so much out of the backfield. He's a little bit more of a guy who I think you move him around a little bit, almost in the same vein as Nyheim Hines. I think he maybe has a little bit more explosive potential, but I think that's kind of the situation that you're looking at here.
And the obvious comparison with the Eagles is I think Darren Sproles, because Gainwell is super short, right? He's 5'7" or 5'8". So that kind of what sparks to mind there. But to me, is this a bigger, a broader offensive question with the Eagles? We have a question from Useful Baker kind of hitting on this point, but it's how much of this is about Jalen Hurts? Because Hurts is carrying the ball an unusual rate for their players, which may be hurting Sanders' carry workload here, but he also is a player that is kind of throwing it down the sidelines or checking down type of quarterback, right? So how would this change with Gainwell if suddenly, Joe Flacco were the quarterback or if Hurts got hurt or if they decided to bench him, looking at, Gardner Minshew as a potential option or something along those lines? How much of this is a product of Hurts' game specifically, or do you think Gainwell maybe has a little bit more that could work with other quarterbacks too?
I mean, I think he's still probably one of their best options to try to get out into space. I mean, I think Devonta Smith is also really good in that regard, and he's obviously just like a much better player, period. He went top 10 for a reason, but I think Gainwell is still really good in space, and I think if they're going to have to be this offense that is very like touchdown to check down, I think Gainwell is a really good shallow check down option for them to try to get the most out of every touch that they're getting in that area, regardless of who the quarterback is. The one thing I would say is that I really don't know how they're going to get the running game going. I don't know what they want to do with it. It seems like Sirianni just has no understanding of run pass balance and doesn't really know how to fix that problem. Because I don't think they're they might not have the best offensive line anymore, but I think they're still a competent offensive line, and they've shown some cool concepts when they do run the ball. They just don't do it. And so I honestly don't know how or if they're going to fix that. But I think at least as far as the passing game goes, Gainwell is still pretty much regardless of quarterback, I think, someone who they're going to try to get the ball to, outside the numbers, that sort of area.
All right, well, that wraps up the 12 waiver wire guys we wanted to hit on today's show. So thanks, everybody, for listening and hopefully following along live on YouTube, Twitch, Facebook, and Twitter. As mentioned, there's a waiver wire article that I wrote that's up on footballoutsiders.com right now with all of these FAB recommendations, and I hit on more guys there. So if you are looking for somebody specific that Derrik and I didn't hit on, check that out. Derrik, obviously always a pleasure to have you on Tuesdays to break this down. Tell everybody where they can read and see all of your great work.
So I mean, you guys can check me out at Football Outsiders. Obviously, I'm going to be doing my film room on Thursday. I think I'm probably writing about the Washington defense.
Okay.
Aaron had mentioned he wanted to see what was up with that, and so
I'm curious.
I'm probably going to.
Sure.
Yeah, because I mean, I think everyone thought they were going to be a top 5 unit, at least top 10, and they look horrendous. So I think it's definitely worth exploring. Over at Bleacher Report, I think pretty soon we're going to start getting in some early grades, which is nice for some of the front 7 stuff that I do. And then over at Odds Checker, obviously, I do some of my betting stuff.
Joey Suck says, writing about the frauds. Well, I'm just happy that he's not talking about the Carolina Panthers in that respect. So I guess we'll go full circle with that. But thanks, everybody, for participating in the chat. And if not, we love it when you guys listen to us on the Football Outsiders Podcast Network as well. However it is that you prefer to consume us, we appreciate your support. Again, we're Monday through Friday in all of our various channels. So swing back tomorrow to hear Aaron Schatz and Mike Tanier with an Ask Me Anything episode. Be sure to send him in whatever questions that you want to ask. And we'll look forward to talking to you again Friday for the fantasy show, previewing the Week 5 games. Until then, everybody enjoy your week.